Yeah? Good evening, everyone. Very happy to see you all here in the room and somewhere through our live stream, YouTube. My name is Elad Lapidot. I am teaching Jewish thought in the University of Lille and am one of the people who are organizing a program here in the Katholische Akademie under the title the Berlin Center for Intellectual Diaspora, where we are trying to bring people and organize discussions around contemporary themes and trying to bring traditions of text and traditions of thinking from various traditions into conversation with one another. I'm very, very happy to have here tonight Vivian Liska, that I will present to you very soon, and Chiara Caradonna and Hagai Dagan. You will also hear something about them from me very shortly. Gathered here to hear Vivian's talk, A Talmudic Disputation Before the Law, Kafka, Benjamin, and Derrida. This lecture stands by itself. It has its own aura, but it is also a part of a larger conversation that has been taking place, still is ongoing in this very room in the last few days, concerning modern Talmudic hermeneutics. We are in the middle of a winter school under that name, and the idea is to explore the Talmud, a very central text in Jewish intellectual tradition, in world intellectual tradition, and looking at this text, this ancient text, as something that is not only a part of the history and the past, but is very much a part of the present. This is why the idea of modern Talmudic hermeneutics, how the Talmud is being read, being interpreted, being received, being negotiated, being continued in modern times and also in a contemporary moment. As we have seen in this workshop already, there are many forms in which the Talmud lives through modernity and through our present time, different ways in which it was received, read, interpreted, imagined, talked about, not talked about, but still was present, being absent, and through that be present. Various different ways. And today we're gonna hear from Vivian about a way in which this text, this intellectual tradition, was present through Franz Kafka and readers of Kafka. And all this around one concept that is important to discussion around the Talmud, the concept of the law. We'll hear all about this shortly from Vivian, and then in a discussion with Chiara, Hagai, myself, and hopefully you all. Before that, I would like to tell you something about the people that are sitting next to me, all good friends and colleagues. I will start with Vivian Liska. She's a professor of German literature and director of the Institute of Jewish Studies at the University of Antwerpen in Belgium. She's also, since 2013, distinguished visiting professor in the Faculty of the Humanities at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. Her research focuses on literary theory, German modernism, and German Jewish authors and thinkers. Kafka is a case in point. She is the editor of the book series Perspective on Jewish Texts and Contexts in the Goiter, co-editor of the Yearbook of the Society for European Jewish Literature, and Arcadia International Journal of Literary Studies. Her recent book publications include Giorgio Agamben's Lehrer Messianismus, When Kafka Says We, Uncommon Communities in German Jewish Literature, and German Jewish Thought and Its Afterlife, a Tenuous Legacy. Chiara Caradonna is a senior lecturer at the Department of Roman Studies of the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. In her research, she deals with modern and contemporary European poetry on the one hand, and with the excessive novel that defies the genre's formal boundaries on the other. In this context, she's particularly interested in the intersections between literature, philosophy, anthropology, and visual arts. She has published, among others, on Paul Celan, Paul Valéry, and Edmund Husserl, Pier Paolo Pasolini, Daniel Sada, and Rainer Rene Müller. Lately, she has been focusing on modern contemporary literature of southern Italy, in particular on the work of Sicilian writer Stefano D'Arrigo. Hagai Dagan is an Israeli author and scholar. He completed his studies at Tel Aviv University and Freiburg, specializing in Jewish thought and philosophy. Dagan obtained his PhD from Tel Aviv University. Currently, he serves as the head of the Israeli culture programs at Sapir College, located in Israel. Dagan has published many books in various genres: nonfiction, novels, poetry. His writings often delve into Jewish myth, fantasy, history, demonology, and their intersections with everyday life, politics, and identity. Among his nonfiction books, The Other God, 2016, Jewish Demons in 2019, and Jewish Mythology, 2003. Among his novels, Demons, again, on Agrippa Street, 2012, Nightingale, 2020, and very recently, Call of the North, from 2023, this very year. Thank all of you for being here. I'm excited for our conversation, but first of all, Vivian, please. Thank you.
Good evening, and Elad, thank you so much for inviting me, for introducing me here, and all together to the Katholische Akademie that has developed into a major intellectual center and does superb activities, notably in the realm of Jewish studies. And it is quite extraordinary that the Talmud in its intellectual dimension is really reviving here more forcefully than in many other places where one would rather expect it than here. Some comments about my my title. I have three names after a Talmudic disputation before the law, and there was Kafka, Benjamin Derrida, and I did add someone I worked on before but thought that I want to leave behind, and that is Giorgio Agamben. You have heard it when Elad read out the list of my books. I did reintroduce him, and for an introduction, I will briefly say why. I will do that in a minute. I also did participate this afternoon in the wonderful winter school talking about the Talmud. And I just got a glimpse of one of the conversations about the boundaries of where the Talmud can reach. Now, the figures that I'm dealing with are definitely beyond the boundaries of strictly Talmudic studies. None of the authors I am discussing here was capable of reading the Talmud in the original, and I don't think that even though at least Derrida could have had easier access to translations, I doubt that they did. I can justify this choice in the context, first of all, by being myself a person coming from literature, and from a certain kind of thinking that does engage with literature, such as Benjamin and Derrida. and where in their way of approaching Jewish thought, I felt that there was a deep interest in what we are discussing here, but indeed not in the narrow sense of the Talmud, but as I hope I will be able to show you beyond that, yes. Now, there has been a discussion in German Jewish, no, actually in Jewish studies, whether just as one cannot talk about philosophers who haven't read their Aristotle and their Plato, whether one can talk about Jewish philosophers as being Jewish thinkers if they haven't read their primary works, and the Talmud being one of them, the question is absolutely legitimate. Given the little that the three figures in my original title did know about the actual, and not only the Talmud, but about the actual Jewish textual tradition, though probably the Talmud is the biggest absence there. How come that I nevertheless do consider them thinkers in the Jewish tradition, and maybe even in the Talmudic tradition? Well, I think that one can talk here, in their case, about remnants of a tradition, and it is, at least for me, particularly interesting to see what it is that remains from a tradition when there is not very much left there. And this is one of the things I want to talk about. What, in the context of modernity, did remain from a certain way of approaching the Talmud. Now, back to my to the reason why I did reintroduce Agamben. In my talk, you will see that Agamben stands for a certain antagonistic approach to how I see that the other figures I'm talking about deal with the law understood very much in the Talmudic sense. And that relates to his adherence to a Paulinian or Pauline thinking, where the abrogation of the law is celebrated, suspension, the abrogation, however you call that which Paul did. A very recent occurrence brought me to bring it back. What I sense, and you will see this in my talk, behind that, in the case of Agamben, call for abrogation of the law, is that idea of love replacing the law, because the law is oppressive, because the law is confining, because the law is unfulfillable. These will be topics that I will talk about. I had, in the aftermath of October 7, an exchange with the Bishop of Antwerp, who had written an article in which, an article in the daily papers, and I knew the bishop before and sometimes came to my institute. So he wrote an article in which he said that the origin of violence in the Middle East now is the fact that the Jews didn't see, didn't hear, or didn't get, or didn't accept the message of love coming from Christ. And that October 7 was thus nothing but an alibi to actually exercise the violence that they are now manifesting where they are. this brought me to an awareness that there could still be instances where that idea of love as the necessary replacement of the law is alive, and not only alive, but applied to current circumstances. And I therefore thought that my talk maybe should be preceded by these remarks, because what I will try to show is that a certain understanding of the law and an understanding that I think lives in the Talmudic approach of it can be a viable alternative, and maybe more than that. But I will leave that to your judgment and the discussion. And what I mean by alternative is to the argument that there is something more humane about love than about the law as presented in the Talmud. Some mottos, I thought I had them here, but I don't. From Vayikra, Leviticus 18:5. You shall keep my statutes and my laws, which a person shall do and shall live by them. I am the Lord. And in the Talmud, the explanation, live by them, by God's statutes and laws, and do not die by them. And another motto from the Talmud, if it is a world you want, then strict justice is impossible. And if it is strict justice you want, then a world is impossible. Before the law stands a doorkeeper. To this doorkeeper comes a man. These first words of Franz Kafka's most famous parable, Before the Law, evoke an archetypal narrative situation. In the juxtaposition of the verb stands with the verb comes, something static and stable is confronted with the onset of an event, a potential encounter. This narrative situation is found in the context of the law, which is generally regarded as in conflict with narrative. It is, however, questionable and has been variously debated whether this encounter between law and man ever takes place in Kafka's parable and what shape this encounter takes. This question obviously involves an understanding of the relationship between the law that is presented here as an abstraction and the man whose life is a narrative. What is it then that happens when this particular man appears, the point at which narrative confronts the law? So in what follows, I shall argue that in the relation between Kafka, Jews, and the Talmud, everything depends on the answer to this question. What happens when the man encounters the law? I will try to sum up Kafka's parable for those who haven't read it in a while in one sentence. Kafka's parable, one of the most widely read and interpreted texts of the past century, describes a scene in which a man seeks access to the law, is denied entry to it, and waits at its door until the end of his life, when the doorkeeper tells the man, who has just seen a little shimmer of light emanating from the door, that this entrance to the law was meant for him alone and that the doorkeeper is now shutting it. The parable consists mainly of a description of the negotiations of the man with the doorkeeper as he strives to gain access to the law. However, the nature of this law is not specified. At first, all that can be known with any certainty is that it designates an immutable entity, in contrast to the man who has an origin, a history, and a destiny. We get to know that the man left his homeland, Heimat, and set out on a journey, that he has a purpose, the access to the law, and arrives at its gate where he will wait, search and reflect, discuss and negotiate, desire and curse before growing old and dying, presumably without having attained his goal. While the law in Kafka's parable is abstract, timeless, and unified, the man is concrete and specific. He lives in a time of waiting and a state of wanting, is characterized by the doorkeeper as insatiable, as unersättlich, as he queries about the access to the law, and that he dies without entering it. The law which the man from the country, der Mann vom Lande, which the man from the country believes ought to be accessible to everyone at all times, but remains unreachable for him, is confronted with the singularity, temporality, and situatedness of lived life in all its creaturely contingency. That the man from the country is, as many have noticed, a translation of the Hebrew word am haaretz, literally a man from the land, but also the designation of one who is ignorant of the law, underlines this creaturely aspect. Beyond suggesting that the am haaretz is outside the law because of his ignorance of it, he is also implicitly put in opposition to a Talmid Chacham, a student of the law. It remains to be seen, however, and I shall come back to this in my conclusion, whether the Am Haaretz, were he to turn into a Talmid Chacham, into a true student of the law, would have fulfilled his wish to enter through its door. The doorkeeper, both mediator and obstacle of the encounter, is described in the story as a representative of the law. He seems to be like a kind of legal or rabbinic authority who marks the separation. He's described with a long beard and a fur coat, and so who marks the separation, but also the link between the law that is said to be immutably there and the man who has a story, a minimal one, but nevertheless a story. In Kafka's parable, the law remains not only unreachable for the man from the country, but also eludes readers' attempts to pin down its meaning and effect. Despite innumerable interpretations of Kafka's law-related texts, especially before the law, but also his novels, The Trial, of which the parable before the law is part, and to a somewhat lesser extent, The Castle, as well as stories such as In the Penal Colony, The New Advocate, The Question of Our Laws, it remains uncertain whether the law in his work is to be understood in primarily juridical, social, and political, or in metaphysical, theological, and religious terms. This uncertainty has elicited numerous, sometimes contradictory interpretations and has inspired often opposing notions of justice and the dichotomy between narrative and the law. I shall here explore concepts of justice by major thinkers who invoke Kafka in ways that intertwine the religious and the secular realms. My focus lies on the role these interpretations assign to the relationship between the law as an authoritative system and narrative as an expression of creaturely life. The two systems most often identified with Kafka's concern with the law are the juridical apparatus of the modern state, on the one hand, and the Jewish tradition on the other. Most interpretation of Kafka's stories involving the law opt for one of these perspectives. In the first case, where the law in Kafka is regarded solely in secular terms, the common practice in recent readings by law and literature scholars, Kafka is depicted either as a critic of the juridical system of his time, with very interesting interpretations. So, for example, reading the trial in terms of the distinction between Austrian and German, between Habsburg and Wilhelmine legal system. So, for example, he's being, there are two men who come in and say, you are verhaftet. And then it says, without having done anything evil, ohne etwas Böses getan zu haben. But the word böse has been scrapped from the Wilhelmine law books, but it still existed in the Habsburg one. So the notion of etwas Böses as a legal term. Inaccessibility, that is, with the Jewish idea of God as an all-powerful but remote other of man. In both cases, these approaches disregard the possibility that Kafka deliberately left open the question of whether the law is to be understood in secular or religious terms, so that you get a kind of oscillation where you have to deal with both. Occasionally, these two realms have been brought together, sometimes to the point of identifying them as in Carl Schmitt's idea that all juridical and political instances are transposition of religious ones. In such cases, so when they are read together, the common denominator underlying both state law and Jewish law is the idea of an all-powerful, almighty sovereign. Kafka's narrative writings confirm then the plight of the human condition of being ruled by an unattainable and powerful sovereign who is the author of the law. When the law, whether state law or theological imperative, is thus seen as oppressive, so oppressed by that authority, Kafka's narratives are regarded as the ultimate description of a terrifying law-ruled world and have come to embody the potential of literature to unmask the possibility of reaching justice through the law as an illusion and to condemn the inaccessible sovereign power ruling over men, whether the authority in the state or God. Walter Benjamin succinctly writes that it cannot be decided whether Kafka's work is devoted to raising the law up high or to burying it. That's a quote. He contends that Kafka has no answer to these questions. It is indeed difficult to make out whether in Kafka's world the obstacle to justice is that the law is omnipresent, or that it is distorted, compromised, crippled to a point that makes it indistinguishable from lawlessness. It is even more difficult to derive a possible alternative to the dismal state of the world depicted in Kafka's stories. It could indeed be said that Kafka's parable Before the Law and his other writings dealing primarily with the law depict a world in which the law is both inaccessible and omnipresent. So, we will now go to thinkers who indeed have dealt with Before the Law in both terms, in both the theological and the secular realm. What I will do in what follows is to discuss two instances, and that these are my Talmudic disputations, two instances where two figures have a disputation about what is going on in Kafka's Before the Law in these terms. So, the one is Giorgio Agamben's disputation with Jacques Derrida, And the second, and probably even more relevant to this context, is the discussion between Walter Benjamin and Gershom Scholem. The first, about Giorgio Agamben and his discussion with Jacques Derrida. For those who don't know, who don't know Giorgio Agamben, and I will keep this very short, he is one of the most radical critics of the legal and political state of our times. He proclaims more forcefully than any other thinker today that sovereign tyranny holds the world in the thrall of an all-pervasive domination. He lets the wretchedness of the present swell before our eyes to the point where only an all-redeeming interruption of the course of events could come to rescue our planet. And he has become notorious in Corona times for accusing the state of imposing laws and mixing. He called this biopolitics, an invasive biopolitics, and he has turned this into a whole book that was heavily criticized by people from all sides. And especially that his first article came out just at the moment when people, especially in Italy, were dying massively in the early stages of Corona. Okay, so attempting to thwart the perpetuation of the dismal state, Giorgio Agamben invokes Walter Benjamin's messianism, and in this context, his readings of Kafka. However, as I will show, there are major differences between Agamben and Benjamin's interpretations of Kafka's approach to the law. In his letter to Gershom Scholem, dated 15 September 34, Walter Benjamin calls his writings about Kafka the crossroad of the roads of my thinking, den Kreuzweg der Wege meines Denkens. The same can be said about Kafka's place in Agamben's work, though in his case, crossroad would not only signify the point where roads leading in opposite directions intersect, but also literally, the last road taken by the Christian Redeemer on his way to the cross. In his interpretations of Kafka's stories, Agamben explicitly argues against one of his precursors, the French philosopher Jacques Derrida, and claims to adopt instead Benjamin's approach to Kafka. So just to sum up what is happening in this debate between Agamben and Derrida, the story of Kafka's story of Before the Law has been read as a story of failure, ein Scheitern, because the man never accessed the law, but on the other hand, he also, as some have pointed out, doesn't have a life, because he spends his whole life there in front of the law. And Giorgio Agamben writes that this is a completely wrong reading, because in reality, what the man from the country before the law succeeds in doing is to finally get the door to the law to be closed. And thereby, the man from the country becomes a kind of Pauline or Paulinian figure who abrogates the law. And Agamben is explicitly critical of Derrida, for whom the negotiation between the man from the country and the doorkeeper is what it's all about. And it is an ongoing and interminable conversation, and that is where the being before the law takes place. Agamben calls this view paralyzed messianism. And for me, this has been a key moment, not only of my book on German Jewish thinkers and their afterlife as a tenuous legacy, but in recent weeks, I have repeatedly come to the insight that there is something that happens in that exchange between Derrida and Agamben that is characteristic of something that is happening in the intellectual world in recent years. It is true that what came under the name of deconstruction, that is related to that kind of ongoing and possibly not going anywhere way of thinking, and it has been criticized for precisely not yielding any result or any position. The moment when Agamben criticizes Derrida for that reading of Before the Law, and he says this is paralysis, there is nothing actually happening. That moment when he says that the great thing is to shut the door to the law is not only a moment that relates to Jewish thinking from a Pauline perspective, but it is also an impatience with a kind of thinking that is ongoing, and instead wanting to position yourself, position as opposed to that kind of negotiation that is taking place. And I felt in recent weeks that I've said this to colleagues before, that this kind of positioning is infesting our current intellectual world. That was in brackets. So for Giorgio Agamben, who can be regarded as a kind of anarchist and antinomian, because for him, Paul, the great thing about Paul is that he can be a model for an anarchist revolution of today. In that idea, he is conflating Jewish law with state law, reads state law as oppressive, and simultaneously back to Jewish law as oppressive. Now, for him, redemption is the reversal of the situation that is described in Kafka's dismal world, and he believes that the solution would be a kind of messianism that he regards as having to come from the one who fulfilled the law once and for all, which is for him Christ. Christ who fulfilled the law, took it upon himself, and since then it has been lifted. He perceives in Kafka's parable a perfect representation of the structure of sovereign action of an oppressive, omnipresent law. In contrast to traditional interpretations, he thus sees this in no way as a kind of Talmudic moment, but as precisely its end. As opposed to Derrida, for whom what is happening before the law is a kind of deciding, this is a quote, deciding to put off deciding, so that there is something in the interminability of that moment that is central. I also must add another bracket. I have since reread Derrida's article Before the Law, and I've realized that there is something going on there that is also not unproblematic. He quotes at length Hegel, who describes the moment when Pompeius, after having after the destruction of the temple, wants to see what the secret of the Jews really is, and the secret that is in the holiest of holies. And Pompeius goes there and sees and expects to find some idol.
Right?
Pompeius.
Oh, Pompeius?
Hegel talks about Pompeius. And what he sees there is nothing, and talks about the treacherous Jews for whom there is nothing in their soul. They pretended to have this secret, and there is nothing. But then Derrida takes this to a place where, for him, the law, and he compares this to Kafka's story, where for him the law is that kind of quasi-sublime, abstract nothing. And I think that, especially from a perspective of the Talmud, this is a thoroughly mistaken reading, because that moment of the erhaben, sublime, is not what is for the Talmud behind the law, very much on the contrary. And to use the word full would be wrong in this context, because full sounds too much like a fulfillment of the way in which I used it before. But it is made up of such extreme diversity linked to everyday life, linked to concrete situation, linked to specifics, that this idea of the all or nothing is, I believe, very untrue to what the Talmud is about. In what follows, I will now turn to a discussion that takes place between Walter Benjamin and Gershom Scholem, and you will see where the connection is. But before that, just one additional proof to the problematic approach by Giorgio Agamben. It is interesting that on several pages of his interpretation of Before the Law, there is no mention of the shimmer of light that is ever so slightly shining through the door. Agamben introduces his reading of Kafka's Before the Law with a claim that he is interpreting the parable from the perspective of Walter Benjamin's conception of messianic law. That's a quote. He says, Benjamin hasn't really directly written about this parable. He has written about the law, but not about, and he will do a reading in the spirit of Benjamin. But then for him, Benjamin is in Giorgio Agamben's book on Paul, it ends on the absolute correlation between Benjamin and Paul. Benjamin himself, indeed, does not give an elaborate interpretation of the parable and merely speaks of the cloudy spot, die wolkige Stelle, at its core. In his notes for a letter to Gershom Scholem, Benjamin even calls the law the blind spot, ein toter Punkt, in Kafka's oeuvre. However, Benjamin's elaborations on Kafka in his important essay, Franz Kafka, for the 10th anniversary of his death, as well as in his exchange about the Prague author, in his correspondence with Scholem, deal extensively with questions of the law. In these writings, Benjamin holds very different views on Kafka, Jews, and justice from Agamben's Pauline reading. There are undoubtedly similarities where secular law is concerned. So there is in Benjamin too, as in his critique of violence, They both point out the mythical nature of the law, the violence of certain oppressive moments in the law. However, what primarily differs in the two is that for Benjamin, Jewish law and state law do not coincide. For Benjamin also, and in this sense, he's not an anarchist in the way Agamben is, lawlessness and oppressive law are not all that different. He writes, in a text that he has never published, it was just a kind of sketch. Kafka, I have this here. In his books, confronts, don't have the full quote. Kafka in his books confronts, so Kafka's novels depict a swamp world, which Benjamin confronts with the lawful one of Judaism. And here's the quote. Judaism's purity and dietary laws display the defense mechanism against this swamp world. In other words, only the halakha, still ex negativo, contains traces of this mode of existence of mankind that is long past. Kafka's books, Benjamin continues, contain the missing Haggadah, so Haggadah, the narrative component of the Talmud, to his halakha, its legal aspect. Intertwined with this Haggadic text is the prophetic dimension in his books. Yes. The world as it presents itself in The Trial and in The Castle, Kafka's novels, this world without distinctions and divisions, without boundaries and order, is thus both a prehistorical Vorwelt and prophetically announces the return of this lawlessness in the present. So it is by no means that Benjamin celebrates the absence of law. But then this world, Benjamin writes, is also our world, because we have not overcome it, only repressed and forgotten it. The lawless world of prehistory depicted by Kafka is for Benjamin also the index of his own present. Writing as a Jew in the 30s, Benjamin describes the legal system of his own times by way of his characterization of Kafka's swamp world, in which laws, far from ordering life, intrude into the whole of everyday life and become identical with the ultimate lawlessness reigning in an oppressive state of exception. In a letter to Scholem, his friend Gershom Scholem, from 1934, Benjamin writes, "Indeed, if we follow Kafka's presentation, the work of the Torah has been thwarted. Das Werk der Torah nämlich ist, wenn wir uns an Kafkas Darstellung halten, vereitelt worden." In his preparations for this letter, Benjamin added, "And everything that Moses once accomplished would have to be made up for in our time. In unserem Weltzeitalter wäre das nachzuholen." Now, it isn't completely clear if Benjamin meant that one has to reconstruct or if one has to reinvent, or what the relation exactly is. But it is certainly so that, Benjamin does not reject Kafka's law when read as a religious law. Benjamin also makes sure to distinguish his reflections on Kafka's halachic dimension from theological readings. In his outline for the unwritten essay, he states, Kafka's prophecy for his immediate future, which is actually the time Benjamin lived in, is much more important than the Jewish theologumena, which one only wanted to find in his works. The punishment is more important than the one who punishes. The prophecy is more important than God. Now, the prophecy for Benjamin, Kafka's prophecy was indeed that he would predict what would happen in the years in which Benjamin lived and died, and the link that this has to something in the Torah that has been thwarted, and Benjamin becomes very clear as to what that is. Between 1925 and 1938, Benjamin and Scholem exchanged a stream of letters about Kafka's work that can count among its most profound interpretations. In the course of the exchange, important dissonances between the two friends come to the fore. These differences concern the role of theology in interpreting Kafka, the importance and nature of the law in Kafka's work, and the understanding of halacha and agadah, so the legal and the narrative parts of the Talmud. Encompassing all these differences is a dissimilar outlook on the Jewish tradition. Surprisingly, Scholem, who is considered generally to be the more Jewish thinkers of the two, is, and this is a claim at the center of my thesis here, further removed than Benjamin from certain core aspects of the Jewish tradition. Less surprisingly, what interests Benjamin more than Scholem are aspects of this tradition that relate to the human, more precisely the political, rather than the divine realm. So 3 points. Benjamin and Scholem disagree on the justification of a theological reading of Kafka. In his reply to Benjamin's account of Kafka's world as a swamp world and its counterpart in the Torah, Scholem writes, the existence of the secret law, so the Kabbalistic rather than the halachic law, destroys your interpretation. In the prehistorical world, there hardly is this chimerical model that you talk about, and certainly not one of the kind that announces its persistent existence. There you went much too far with the elimination of theology. Scholem indeed regards the possibility of divine judgment as the sole concern of Kafkas writings, die Möglichkeit des Gottesurteils, as opposed to Benjamin, for whom Kafka is not at all about the divine judgment, but for Benjamin he is, and this is where he introduces the Talmudic categories. So while Scholem thinks in theological categories, Benjamin, though he acknowledges a certain shadowy theological dimension, is less interested in God and more interested with the ways the Jewish Talmudic tradition, more particularly the interaction between halacha and agadah, provide insights to the dismal world depicted in Kafka's fiction. Rather than seeing a Kabbalistic nothingness of revelation, that's Scholem's term, Benjamin regards the distortion of existence of the upcoming legal system, precisely a system that for which the laws become lawlessness itself, which was the system under National Socialism as Benjamin described it. Scholem and Benjamin have also, so the first point is that they have a different view of theology, whereas Scholem does affirm it, Benjamin does not. The second point is a different understanding of the halacha. Unlike Benjamin, so the legal aspect of the Talmud, unlike Benjamin, who sees it as an antidote to the chaotic medley of the prehistoric swamp world, Scholem is skeptical of the halacha in the name of his own views of Kafka as a heretical, antinomian Kabbalist in the tradition of Shabtai Tzvi. Scholem writes to Benjamin, not, dear Walter, the absence of the revealed law is the problem, but instead its impossibility to be fulfilled. Nicht, lieber Walter, die Abwesenheit, sondern die Unvollziehbarkeit des Gesetzes ist das Problem. I'm done. This relates to Scholem's view of Kafka, who believes that the Kafka has that kind of nothingness that one finds again then in Derrida, but that also relates to the Pauline view of unfulfillability. So when Paul says that the law has to be rescinded because it cannot be fulfilled, and it turns us all into sinners. The third and final way in which they disagree is related to the Haggadah. The Haggadah as the narrative aspect where, for Benjamin, there is that is the real moment where Kafka becomes Talmudic, and in a certain sense that presents a kind of halting. So he talks about a mighty paw that the Haggadah is presenting to the Halakha as a kind of limiting the law through an introduction of the concrete human that is present in narratives. And this brings us back to the very beginning, because just as this mighty paw is creaturely like the man from the country, it is also that he comes with his full human specificity and concreteness. And that is how the halakha is necessary to prevent the lawlessness, and the Haggadic part is the one that brings the concrete human dimension in, and it is together that they create an idea of justice that is not as those who claim that love has to replace the law, but that there is built into the Talmud itself are the two dimensions of the one that creates the order and the other that introduces the creaturely human self.
Thank you very much, Vivian, for these Talmudic disputations around Kafka's law. And I invite Hagai to give his response.
Thanks. So thank you so much for this fascinating study. I don't read Kafka as any of the people you just confronted, and therefore I found it particularly interesting and challenging. So it raises many questions, but I would focus on one particularly. The interesting question that lies within this study is, how Jewish is all that? And if it is Jewish, in what sense? Is Kafka's concept of the law parallel to the halachic one? Or is it a demonized, quasi-Paulinian halachic concept? Another question intertwined with the last one refers to the nature of halachic law as such. Is it, to proceed Paul, a law bereft of God, a sort of a secular law disguised as a religious one, or rather a sort of a complicated religious law that regains its religiosity by its slippery interaction with Agadah? As Halbertal shows, there is no single type of Agadah, and the relations between the two, the halakha and the Agadah, are accordingly varied. Is the Chazal law, is the law as presented in early halakha immutable? Is it conceptualized and presented this way? In some cases, for sure, but some scholars describe the law as it is reflected in the Chazal discussion, as opposed to later halachic enterprises, such as the Maimonides Mishneh Torah, as rather dynamic and flexible. As I was thinking about that, I went back to the famous Bialik essay, Halacha and Agada, written in Odessa in 1916. Bialik writes that the Halacha is mostly presented as strict, dry, fossilized, whereas Agada as soft, flexible, rejuvenating, and sentimental. He argues that this is a superficial view. Actually, Halacha and Agada are not necessarily opposites. They are two sides of one coin. Agada is the internal content, ideology, ethos, formed as narrative, and Halacha is its practical manifestation. And as any practical manifestation, it also limits the Agada and even negates it sometimes. The Agada, in its turn, rephrases the Halacha and turns it into a story. Halachic laws are thus intertwined in the myth and stories of the collective. Contrary to Scholem, Bialik writes of a Halacha that draws from the upper divine world, which he refers to as Olam Ha'atzilut, which is a Kabbalist concept. He further maintains that the Halacha is not the opposite of literature and poetics, because it is very picturesque and descriptive, but, he adds, not always narrative, in the sense that it doesn't tell a whole story, just bits and pieces. And I would add to that, the Agada tends to convey something I would call broken stories. They start at some middle, they jump from one thing to another. In this sense, they might resemble some parts of Kafka's Castle, for example. So, according to Bialik's argument, the borders between Halacha and Agada are rather elusive. If we read Kafka's fable along those lines, we can say that it doesn't necessarily present a dichotomy of law and poetics. You said something similar yourself, but rather presents the defeat of whatever could pose as poetics in the face of that which presents itself as law, be it God or human malice or nothing at all. Further, that which presents itself as law remains nebulous and dark. So it definitely isn't a law in any simple meaning of the word, but rather a story, because mystery is always a story. This dark quality related to law may sound Paulinian, but one can find it in the Chazal scriptures as well. A good example would be the Talmud story about Moses meeting God on the Sinai mountain in Menachot 29b. In this story, God embellishes the law, but the law remains ominous and unintelligible. Why? Because it is godly. It is the law that was imposed on Israel, Har Kegigit. The mountain was overturned on them like a tub. Christian theologians from Paul to Rudolf Otto have had difficulties with a dry law because it sounds too human. If we conceptualize human as dry, that is unpoetic. Chazal sometimes resonate the same sentiment and sometimes its opposite, as in the famous Talmud story, Tanuro shel Achnai, sorry for bringing up such a corny example, in which the law is being separated from its divine origin and defined as logical and prosaic. Two final remarks. One, I found the idea that the man from the country is an Am Haaretz very interesting. And then I thought that actually in the Chazal tradition there are a few such Amei Aratzot that become Talmidei Chachamim, scholars, which mean they enter the law, such as Rabbi Akiva and Reish Lakish. Two, concerning Scholem. in this correspondence with Benjamin, but also in other places. As you very well put it, Scholem's perspective is in this sense in agreement with the Paulinian one, expressed also by Agamben. I might add to that, they all demonstrate discontent with the halakha. Scholem reveals himself in this context once more as not just a scholar of Kabbalah, but to a certain extent as a Kabbalist. He looks beyond the dry halakha to the living core of mystery and divine secrets. In this sense, Agadah could be seen as a correction or an appeasement to halakha only as far as it is aligned with Kabbalah, which is far from obvious. Actually, Scholem, following certain Kabbalists, such as the author of Raya Mehemna, turns Judaism against itself in the sense that he assumes a non-halachic authentic core that undermines the exterior klipa of halakha. This core could be God in his Kabbalist depiction, or the utopian potential of halakha itself, the vision of the divine kingdom to come. As a matter of fact, some thinkers and scholars, for example, Boaz Evron, presented the whole halachic structure as one that cannot be fulfilled and was not designed to be fulfilled. Scholem finds in Kafka a remote ally to this view, but this is quite far-fetched. I find it quite far-fetched. It is very difficult to trace in Kafka some shining core underneath the dull reality or behind the gate of law. In this sense, Kafka is nor Paulinian, neither Scholemian. As I read him, the very hope to find something underneath all that is our greater disaster. And this very hope, this very disaster, is what one might call human life. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hagai, for this response, and I invite Chiara to give hers.
Thank you very much, Elad, for inviting me, first of all. Thank you, Vivian, for coming to Berlin and sharing your thoughts with us. Thank you, Hagai, for opening the response round. And thank you, the Katholische Academy, for hosting us. I feel a bit intimidated to sit in front of an audience of people who have been discussing these things for quite some hours now. And I was very touched in the beforehand while preparing the response, because Vivian sent us her paper, and also by rereading it from the constellation that you created between Kafka, Benjamin, Scholem, Agamben, Derrida. You almost went anti-chronologically, you went backwards, right? And it reminded me a lot, and maybe it wasn't stressed enough, about your concern in recent years with the daily life and with things that happen in the smallest corners of our lives. And your reading of the Tower of Babel, where you highlight what is happening against the background of a collapse or a destruction. If you remember the Tower of Babel by Bosch, there are a lot of small, tiny daily life scenes, people cooking, people cleaning, people doing all kinds of things. And I think this is your concern also in these days. What is most, foregrounded for me, and maybe it's important to stress a little bit my background. I am not an expert of the Talmud at all, and I think I come here more as someone who has been reading and thinking about Kafka and about Agamben and Derrida a lot. so my approach to the castle actually has been one of law and literature. I have been interested in how Kafka discusses the presence of international, or the insurgence of international law after World War I, and how the protagonist of the castle, K, is actually a sans-papier who arrives in a place and doesn't have any papers and anything to identify himself with, and invents himself as a Landvermesser, which he is actually not. So the question of the relation between secular and religious law, what this relation should be, how it should be thought and constructed, is something that is that concerns me a lot. And I agree that the question of what law are we talking about is very central in all of these thinkers, and it's very confusing. But they are oftentimes, especially in recent times, in conflict with one another, and their fields of authority clash with one another. So if the law can keep up with a changing world and guarantee its justice, both the secular and the religious law, seems to me a question that is central in the discussion that you're sharing with us. Because so much of what we are living today escapes codification, both in the secular law and in the religious law. I was reading a little bit and watching about, for example, drone technologies nowadays in warfare, because there is no legal codification of their use. So what is it that escapes the law? What is not inside the law that has to be taken in the law? So I completely agree with you in your critique of Agamben of doing away with the law. We need the law to somehow create a space of justice. And I think your underscoring of narrative, of the role of storytelling when there is no codified law to protect us, is very important. So one of my questions is, can storytelling, can the narrative actually bring about the laws that we need? Not the laws that are not efficient or effective anymore, but the laws that we need. So here it happens, in Kafka stories, it happens at the cost of the man of the land, who is subjected to an incredible violence. And this thought that I had, is the narrative bringing about a future law, is of course a Benjamin, thought of Benjamin. Benjamin says at some point, we don't know whether Kafka's parables, Gleichnisse, refer to the past, to a law that already exists, or to a future, to a law that still has to be codified. But the man of the land, and this is something that is absent from most of these discussions, theoretical discussions on before the law, is, apart from Benjamin's discussion, is the violence that he's threatened by the guardian, right? He's really subjected to a very violent use of language. He is shouted at. He's not treated particularly kindly. So when everybody says, why doesn't he simply enter? Well, there is a Türhüter, He's just abiding by an institution. So what are the conditions for us to access the law? Who can access the law? What are the conditions of possibility to access the law? I think this is a very central question. And this is why I would stress this worldly element even more, maybe take it into a more political corner, because, and emphasize Benjamin's reference to the oppressed and to those for whom the law is applied arbitrarily, to those who are not protected from its abuses because they don't know the law well enough, for example. My grandfather always used to say, you should study law because then you can, come up for yourself, protect yourself. And I studied literature instead. But because I think, or it seems to me, that the problem is how the law, whether religious or secular, is applied, and how the relation between these two is realized. This raises, of course, the problem of interpretation, and this is what was central, I think, in your reflection. And more crucially, the question of attention, which Benjamin in his Kafka text calls, by quoting Malebranche, the natural prayer of the soul. And I agree when you say that there is an impatience with the construction in Agamben. Agamben is not an attentive reader. And one of the most interesting things that you can do when you read Agamben is to look very closely at what is left out, what he doesn't quote, or what he quotes only partially. So I would like to interrogate you, Vivian, and all of you here present, on some apparently secondary paradoxicalities and Auslassungen, things that are left out, things that are forgotten and, as Benjamin says, can be recuperated, but when they are recuperated, they are entstellt. We don't recognize them anymore in their entirety, like Odradek in Kafka, or the Bücklich Männlein. So these Auslassungen in relation to Vor dem Gesetz and in its reception. And I want to start with Agamben, because I think an important point to stress here in his text on Kafka is that he's not interested at all in the literary aspects, of course, but he's also not interested in the political dimension. And what he's interested in is philosophy. He wants to clarify the status of philosophy, and he says that constitutively the philosophy is impegnata in un confronto con la legge, engaged in a confrontation with the law. And so philosophy meets religion in the point where they both are confronted with messianism and put in crisis by messianism. So this is his concern. This is what interests him. So I'm not even sure he's really interested in the law itself. It's a self-justification of philosophy, in a way, in its confrontation with the law. So he begins his text on the Messiah and the sovereign with Benjamin's 8th thesis on the concept of history, but he quotes only the first part, the first section, and not the second one, which is the very concrete reference that Benjamin makes to fascism. So he says that we need to rethink history and a history of the oppressed in order to access this history of the oppressed. And he doesn't refer to the fact, and here I wanted to quote the sentence, das Staunen darüber, dass die Dinge, die wir erleben im 20. Jahrhundert, noch möglich sind, ist kein philosophisches. Benjamin says the surprise, or the surprise that things that we are living currently in the 20th century are still possible, that these horrors are still possible, is no philosophical surprise or sense of impotence. So Benjamin is actually countering this. He's not interested in a philosophical reaction to what is happening. And he brings in this formulation that I want to refer to in a minute, of the Tradition der Unterdrückten, the tradition of the oppressed. But before that, I found it very interesting. So this is the first Auslassung. Agamben is really quoting only half of the thesis, and the thesis is 10 sentences, so it wouldn't have been a problem quoting it entirely, and Agamben does this a lot. He has no problems with big quotations, so it's not. It's a strategic point. So I would take issue with considering him an anarchist, simply because I think anarchism has a much more stronger base than simply lawlessness, let's say. But so this is one Auslassung, and the other is, and I think this is a very interesting point in the reception of Kafka, is that in Italian, the Mann vom Lande, and I really love this stress on the Am Haaretz, is translated as contadino, peasant. So Agamben, but also Cacciari, whom he quotes, are looking at the Mann vom Lande as a peasant, which he clearly is not, because he's bringing a lot of goodies with him that he can, sell to the Türhüter. So he doesn't seem to be, really a peasant in any case. And of course, the Jewish reference is completely lost. So this would be one thing, how you would see these Auslassungen in the context of reading, of attention, right? Of the kind of reading that also the Talmudic reading invites us to carry out, and the kind of conversation that it engages, it demands us to have. So whether from different traditions, we are invited also to different kinds of attention. The Tradition der Unterdrückten is a paradoxical formulation, because the Unterdrückte, because they are oppressed, they don't have a tradition. This is exactly the point that Benjamin makes. And I think, and I would like to know what you think about it, whether these parables in Kafka are, in fact, a kind of Tradition der Unterdrückten. This is how I think Benjamin indirectly also reads them, right? Because we have the experience of the people that are excluded from the law, that are not participating in the law. What happens to them? What is their kind of reading? What kind of attention do they develop? And I think this is the point that fascinates me the most in this parable, that by sitting, and when neither Agamben nor Derrida refer to it, by staying outside, the man develops a kind of attention to his surroundings that is much acuter. He ends up talking to the fleas and the fur of the Türhüter. So he's reading the world. He's not reading a text anymore. He's reading what is around him, and suddenly finds a way to speak to a flea, which is a kind of very special thing that happens there. So the other paradox that I wanted you all to comment on, what your thoughts are about that, is this first sentence in Kafka's Vor dem Gesetz. Dieses Vor dem Gesetz steht ein Türhüter. Because, and this is a bit the direction that Derrida goes into, das Gesetz is not a place. It's not a physical place. So how can you enter something that is not physical? And of course you can say, okay, it's an allegory, it's a metaphor, it's not to be taken literal. But what happens if we take it literal, in a literal sense? If we think of the Gesetz as a temple, exactly? Or what happens when we, turn the law back to a place that we can inhabit somehow, and from which the light comes? And then the final point that I wanted to make regarding to the parable is, and this summarizes the question of reading and of interpretation. As you know, probably Vor dem Gesetz was published in two different contexts. One in a collection of short stories, Der Landarzt, during Kafka's lifetime, and the other a year after Kafka's death, in the process, in the chapter in the Dom. And I think it's nice to remember it in the Katholische Akademie. It's a parable that is recounted by the prison priest. And after the prison priest tells this story, and this story, he says, is put at the beginning of the books of the law, the Gesetzbücher. So it is the entrance to das Gesetz, literally, right? It's the parable itself is the entrance to das Gesetz. They engage after the priest tells him this story. They engage in a very long disquisition on its meaning. So I think it is fascinating that Kafka created this double context: the context in which we as readers become the interpreters, become the discussants, become the hermeneutes, the one that try to understand the parable. And then, in the process, he actually showed us what the different positions are and what the possibilities are of an interpretation. And there, the priest himself says a very illuminating, but very problematic, of course, as K. also points out, sentence: Richtiges Auffassen einer Sache und Missverstehen der gleichen Sache schließen einander nicht vollständig aus. The right understanding of a thing and the misunderstanding of the same thing do not exclude each other completely. Thank you.
Thank you, Chiara. Vivian, would you like to quickly respond to, you don't have to, you know, everything, but if you have like 1 or 2 points to make in response.
Well, very briefly, I was both impressed and shocked by the idea of human life as the disaster that lies underneath. I think that it does come very close to Kafka, but the human life in it there indeed reflects what I tried to capture in the Talmudic rather than the Kabbalistic, in the Benjaminian of entstelltes Dasein. Entstelltes Dasein comes very close to what you call human life as a disaster. And so I think that my reading very much goes in that direction. As to Chiara, anyway, thank you both. It's been so rich that I can really only pick some small aspects. Whether the storytelling can go into law, whether storytelling can become a law. There is this very beautiful sentence where Benjamin describes Kafka, and I'll just read this last part of the sentence. Kafka's stories are like the narrative parts of the Talmud. They are an Agadah that constantly pauses, luxuriating in the most detailed descriptions in the simultaneous hope and fear that they might encounter the halachic order en route. So the question whether a narrative can turn into the law, I think it is captured here very succinctly, that it could, you know, actually happen that it turns into a law, but there's, at the same time, there is the fear that what it would lose would be precisely the human life as disaster or not. So the texture of the creaturely and of the human that is carried in these, and of the specific and the concrete that is carried in the Agadic could. So there is the hope that it indeed confirms it, but there is also the fear that that is what it becomes.
Thank you very much. We still have a few minutes left for this evening, so I open now the floor for questions. I see one question already there. Please, Gesine.
Okay. Now you can hear me?
Yes.
Okay. First of all, thank you very much, all of you. It is great as a person who has engaged a lot with the Paulinian questions concerning the law and basically took part in a theological process of revisioning the antinomianist Christian interpretation of Paul and what he is supposed to fight against, right? And one thing is, which we, in quotation marks, always try to stress, is that there is a big confusion between a law which is always something like an equivocation with judgment. And I may just hint here at the fact first that even in worldly law, it is not the judge alone who makes the law, but there's always a judge, an accusation and a vindication, and the judge, and the three of them make the applying of the law to any case whatsoever, even in secular, worldly, political law. The second point I want to make is just a small hint. There is a kind of Tosefta to the Mishnah of Walter Benjamin's Kafka essay, which is a Kafka essay written in the same year by Soma Morgenstern. And he interprets the story of the Before the Law as seducing its readers into the world where the rule is coming from the whispering voice eines erbittlichen Richters, which I cannot translate. Perhaps some of you can. I mean, it's not the unerbittlicher Richter, but the erbittlicher Richter, which is
a lenient judge.
A lenient judge, which is something entirely different because it doesn't have this kind of crazy phantasma of a law which has to be entirely fulfilled or completed or...
Absolutely.
Yeah, so maybe this helps to say that there can be an approach from the other side also that is a bit more lenient than this, what Agamben indeed represents, as if nothing has ever happened since.
Thank you. I was very inspired, Gesine, by your article on this.
Other questions, remarks from the public, from the audience? I wanted to ask something. In Kafka's texts, because we're talking about how narrative can move to law.
Yes.
And so to speak, there is the Agada without halacha. But very often in Kafka, it feels like he's doing halacha. That his narration she's thinking as a jurist, which is not surprising, as he was one. It seems that his narration, sometimes the object of the halacha of his reasoning is not clear, or it seems trivial, or something that you would not associate with a question of law, like a certain thought that goes through your head, or a certain act that is taking place, or a certain creature that is being negotiated or thought about. But it seems that the logic of the narration is a legal, is how a legal scholar or legal practitioner will write. And again, unsurprisingly, how do you?
Yes, but I think that it is much more Talmudic than legal in the state situation, because with very few exceptions, there is no closure in Kafka. So it is not about coming to the psak, coming to the actual judgment. Very few exceptions. And so that Daniel Boyarin described the distinction between the Talmudic and the Talmudic notion of ongoing discussion and debate as opposed to the doxa. And here it is not that you have a norm in Kafka. You don't have a normative system that is then in any way reaches a final judgment. There's the one case where it comes close is in the trial itself. In the trial, at the end, he's murdered. So it's a terrible judgment, and it's an illegitimate judgment, but it seems to be a closure. And the fascinating thing about that moment is the sentence before last. The two men who killed him, who killed the protagonist, Joseph K., they look at him, and in German it says what they see is die Entscheidung. The murder itself, Entscheidung, the final absolute decision, is called murder. So even there, where that is the place where one can say, no, it's not true that Kafka doesn't come to closure, there it is undone by calling it a murder to end like that. So if we take up that notion of Talmud, and I'm not sure how widely accepted that is, that idea of just an ongoing, not going to any final point. If that is the case, then I think that Kafka is a Talmudist all the way.
So a clear case, another clear case of a modern Talmudic hermeneutics. Thank you very much, Vivian, for this lecture. Thank you, Chiara and Hagai, for the responses. Thank you all for your attention. Let's please help me. We can continue the conversation and exchanges over a glass of wine, and I think also a pretzel is waiting outside. Please stay.
Thanks, really amazing responses and thoughtful and rich. I would love to read them.